And good afternoon, and welcome to this World Oregon webinar with Professor Timothy Snyder. We are thrilled to be doing this webinar when we welcome those joining us in Oregon and across the country and frankly around the world. And we'll be diving into the program just in a minute here. Before we do, a few pointers about this webinar if you haven't been in a World Oregon webinar before. Similar to other webinars, the only folks who with video and audio are our speakers here today. You can post questions for our expert in the Q&A function of Zoom. The Q&A function of Zoom, please. We will be posting in chat a few relevant links for the audience, both about this speaker and other upcoming events. And so everyone else will have your audio and video muted, again, through the Q&A function. Then your questions will be worked into the discussion. We'll also be posting the link if those of you are interested in buying the book but haven't had a chance to do that yet with a special coupon, so stay tuned for that. Again, a couple quick notes before we start. Our next program scheduled, it's coming up April 17th in Portland with Jill Doherty, the former CNN Moscow anchor, talking about Russia. We're thrilled about that program. We will post that registration link in the chat. Lots of other good programs coming up. But then a special note that in this times of great disruption and federal funding freezes and just an uncertain world, we encourage the community, be you local or be you far away, to join us at Bridge Together, our annual fundraiser celebrating this year our 75th anniversary, April 30th. The event is at the Reeser in Beaverton for those of you who are local, and you can join us that evening. For those of you around the world, you can always donate, must not be present to donate. And so we really appreciate your support. It is a challenging time for nonprofits, and we appreciate your support in helping us connect the world together. So, in that spirit, I'm going to pass it off to Director of Programs Tim DeRoche, who will talk about this program. And we'll, like I said, we will post in the chat some links that are relevant to the audience. One final note is we are recording this program, and it'll be shared for ticket buyers after the fact later this week, for there are some who are not able to join us live. Thanks so much. Tim, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Derek. Professor Snyder, thank you so much for joining us. I want to say some thanks before we get going. Many very special thanks to our friends at Penguin Random House for helping coordinate this event, and our deep, abiding gratitude to our local independent bookselling partners, Broadway Books, who revel in community building and good books and traffic and rich ideas, and they were always a joy to work with. This event is also made possible with the promotional support of the World Affairs Councils of America, of which we are a member. As an attendee of today's program, you would have received information on purchasing Snyder's books. We put a link in the chat. I'm very excited also to have with us today Leah Sotilli joining me for today's conversation. Leah Sotilli is an investigative journalist whose work has been published by the New York Times Magazine, the Washington Post, and the BBC, among many other outlets. She is also the host of the podcasts Hush and Bundyville, and the author of two books, Blazing Eye Sees All, which was just released this week, I think yesterday, and also When the Moon Turns to Blood. And as a slight little plug, she is doing an event at Powell's in Portland, the main Powell's, tomorrow. So you can find out about that. We're very delighted you could join us for this special virtual program with acclaimed Yale historian and New York Times bestseller Timothy Snyder, whom The Guardian has called one of the leading interpreters of our dark times. As he explores the concept of freedom, what it is, how it's been misunderstood, and why it is worth fighting for both here and abroad. Timothy Snyder is the Richard C. Levin Professor of History and Global Affairs at Yale and a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. His books, which have been published in over 40 languages, include Bloodlands, Black Earth, On Tyranny, The Road to Unfreedom, Our Malady, and the more recent one on freedom. His work has inspired poster campaigns and exhibitions, sculptures, a punk rock song, a rap song, a play, and an opera, and I doubt there's any other professor at Yale who can say that. With his best-selling On Tyranny and his Substack Thinking Snyder has been striking a very resonant chord and engages us in startling and accessible questions and reinterpretations of the world around us. like how we should embrace, think about, and act on freedom. What are the habits of mind that allow us to design a government in which we and future generations can flourish? So perhaps we can begin with a couple of these questions like, what is freedom and what is freedom not?
All right. I mean, I thank you, first of all, thanks for the kind invitation and for the kind introduction. I I wrote the book about freedom in an unusual way, as a series of vignettes, incorporating history and philosophy and personal experience and some music and some art and all sorts of things, because freedom is not the kind of thing you can just be propositional about. You can't say, well, freedom is this or freedom is that. And I think a big problem with our tradition of writing and thinking about freedom is that it is so propositional that we've tried to find ways to bind it and define it precisely. And the easiest way to define it precisely turns out to be wrong and dangerous. It's easy to find freedom precisely if you define it negatively. If you say freedom is just about the government not infringing my rights, for example. And of course, that's very attractive and it's very elegant. It created all kinds of memorable formulations, in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, things that we like to remember, like my freedom, my freedom stops where, your nose starts. These sorts of things are very attractive because they're simple. Or, the ideas like the free market of ideas, that so long as the government doesn't intervene, we'll all have our opinions and the truth will rise to the top, which of course is complete nonsense. I mean, if you're alive in the 21st century, you have to be aware that that's not only true, it's self-contradictory, because it's absolutely not true, and it has risen to the top, so it's like self-disproving. But but the elegant answers are false, and they're also dangerous. So now I'm on what freedom is not. It's dangerous to think that freedom is just about the government not oppressing me, because then I define all of politics and all of political and moral life as a kind of line between me and the government. And I define myself as just being something that is potentially oppressed by the government. And in this way of thinking, the only possible enemy is the government, and therefore the cause of freedom is always served by making the government smaller. And I think it's fair to say that argument has won the day in America, that at least since Reagan, that's the way that probably most Americans think about freedom, is negatively. It's us against the government, keep the government small, push the government out. Now, the problem with that, or there are at least two. One problem with that is the political one, which is that if you just decide that you're going to make the government small, you'll end up with a dysfunctional government. And we can talk more about this, but that's very much what's happened in January and February and March of 2025. We voted for negative freedom and we're getting a dysfunctional government. And that dysfunctional government, by the way, among other things, can't protect your rights. And also, it can't provide the things that you need in order to be a free person, which I'll talk about in a minute. The ethical problem, though, may be deeper, which is that if you just define freedom as being not oppressed by the government, and you define your actions as just being against the government, you haven't actually paused to ask the question of who you are and what you stand for, which allows me to shift to what I think freedom actually is, which is something positive. I think what's special about us, what makes us different from the rest of the world, is our ability to live in virtues, our ability to think that some things are better than others, our ability to go through life evaluating and judging a whole range of different, sometimes contradictory, but nevertheless good things, and work those things together in personal, unique combinations, which over time become something like personal character or moral character. And so freedom is positive because freedom is the condition in which we can do that. It's the value of values in the sense that it's the one that allows us to mix all the other values. And politically, it's also positive because if you accept that freedom is not just being against something, then you have to ask, well, what are the conditions which allow us to be the kinds of creatures where we can be for things, where we can actually change the world around us according to our values? And that, of course, requires collective action. The negative freedom paradigm, which is wrong, is elegant and persuasive, not least because it imagines us to think, oh, we can be free all by ourselves, which is, it's a lovely idea. Consider Hollywood. Like at the end of the day, it's always a lonely American standing in the back of a pickup truck with a lightsaber, defeating the aliens, right? Like that's it, right? That's what we want. But of course, freedom never actually works like that. If you're all by yourself, you've already lost and you're not going to be free. Freedom, becoming a free person requires all kinds of collective labor. from mothers and fathers and parents and families and friends, and ultimately institutions that allow cooperation, that generate the time for children and the time for all of us all through our lives. And so freedom to exist, like for humans to be free, we have to have collective organized politics. So in that sense, freedom is positive as well. So anyway, that's my short answer as to what freedom is and what freedom is not.
I think that's interesting. Sorry, Tim, just to jump in here. I was reading on freedom and thinking so much about how what you're talking about now, how much of that book is about definitions. A lot of my questions I have for you today are about definitions in this. And because so much of the work that I have done on far-right extremist groups, on the anti-government militia movement, is where definitions of common words are redefined. So, for example, patriotism in the context of the patriot movement is the opposite of patriotism. So I wanted to ask you, from your research globally, is the process of redefining terms like freedom and patriotism, a hallmark trait of fascism?
Well, that's a wonderful question. Thank you, by the way, for not following up about pickups. Like I realize there's a lot of knowledge about pickups in Oregon, and I wasn't forced back into the defensive position of saying, actually, I drive a pickup, which is true. But I'm glad the conversation didn't go down those lines. Yeah, so let me talk about that. Because first, it helps me to make a broader point about negative freedom. So in the American version of negative freedom, it's usually about the government. That the only problem is the government. If we got rid of the government, everything would be fine. And of course, that's not true. You get rid of the government, and everything's a wreck, and the oligarchs are in charge, and there's chaos and robbery, right, and violence. That's what is happening, and that's what will continue to happen if we keep going down this quote unquote libertarian, mudslide that we're now on. But negative freedom can also take on other forms. Like negative freedom is it's like the form of magical thinking which says we would all be free if not for X. And that's never true, right? Because we can only be free by doing things ourselves and by building things ourselves. That's how we can be free. We can't be free just by wishing something away, right? So there were people during the Enlightenment, for example, who thought, well, if we could just get rid of the belief in God, then we'd all be free. Right, that's the heavy hand is like our theological misunderstanding or our faith. If we get rid of faith, we'll all be free. But that turns out not to be true. That you can get rid of faith and people will still behave incredibly badly and they will oppress one another. Witness French Revolution, Russian Revolution, whatever. And then there are people who thought, well, if we could only get rid of private property, that would be the thing. Those are the Marxists. Private property is the original sin. If it weren't for private property, we wouldn't be corrupt and we would regard each other as brothers and sisters and everything would be honky-dory. And although that's a lovely thought, it turns out not to be true. You can get rid of private property, but somebody is still going to end up controlling the stuff, as in the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union itself ends up becoming, in fact, like a long ante-room for fascist capitalism, which is where they are right now in Russia. So and then, to get a little bit darker, you can also say, well, if it weren't for the Jews, and now I'm moving towards fascism, right? If it weren't for the Jews control everything. It's a conspiracy. A fascist can say, if it weren't for them, and that's, the first and second chapter of Mein Kampf, essentially, that the folk are going to be free if we get rid of the Jews. And so what I want to try to say is that this notion of negative freedom has a longer and broader history, and that the fundamental notion of wanting to get rid of something in order to be free you can say that some of those versions are more wrong than others, but they're all logically wrong in the same way. They're all logically wrong in that freedom has to come out of us positively. It has to involve us being our own eccentric, risk-taking, slightly weird selves, along with other people whom we're able to admit that we are who we are and cooperate with. Like that's what freedom is like. Freedom isn't, destroying something else. So as for freedom, I just wanted to set that up because there is certainly, it's the case that almost everybody talks about freedom. The Stalinists talk about freedom and the fascists talk about freedom. And it's always in terms of getting rid of the thing which is in your way, right? For the Stalinists, it was capitalism and private property. For Hitler, it's the Jews. But it's always about getting rid of something. And then they say that's going to be freedom, right? It's always the same mistake. So I wouldn't say it's so much about like capturing the word freedom as a different, like a a deeply historical but very different understanding of freedom, which is about getting rid of something which is in your way. And that's what that's what I'm trying to work against.
So one of the aspects you talk about, I love the sort of 5 points. One of them is the question of factuality, and you talk about factuality being a form of freedom. And you've also spoken a lot about I think you referred to it as the portal of alternate reality, the big lie. And we're seeing a lot of sort of facts versus non-truth. My favorite recent one was the congressional resolution that makes a calendar day not a day. What are we to do with when we don't have collective truth? How do we proceed from that point?
Yeah, it's not it's like it's kind of like a can't get there from here type situation, isn't it? You know, if you don't want to be on that island, you don't want to be on that island where the sand doesn't actually hold you up. You want to start somewhere else from the point that you're describing. So first, let me just clarify, because I'm going to assume that most people on this call have not actually read the book. The beginning of On Freedom is the philosophy where I try to make that argument for freedom being positive that I rehearsed very briefly at the beginning. And the end of On Freedom is the policy prescriptions. And in the middle are what you've just described, that the 5 forms, which is where the theory is meant to come together with the real world to describe how one has to act in order to be free. And so the first one is sovereignty, which is about child rearing. The second one is unpredictability, which is about youth and resisting the machine. And the third is about mobility, which is social mobility, but also physical. The last one is about solidarity. And the fourth one is, as you say, factuality. So this is just how the book is structured. I think with factuality, the key thing, there are 2 parts of this for me. There's the naivete and there's the institutions. And I think it's very important to be naive about this, or to sound naive, and to say things like, I believe in truth, which I think it's, of all the things I say in public, like I believe in truth is the one maybe which makes the crowds the most uncomfortable, because we've all been trained, so to such an extent to think, well, truth is relative, or it's subjective, or it comes from a standpoint. And like, I get all those arguments. I make all those arguments. I am also a university professor. I know where those traditions come from. I read those books, but the we've gotten to the point where all the qualifications about truth, like the quantity of the qualifications about truth, has led to the quality of not believing in truth, or being ashamed to say that you believe that there is truth. And with all appropriate qualifications, and one can debate what they are, if you drop the belief that there is truth, you are also going to drop freedom. You can't do one without the other, because if in order for there to be freedom, we have to accept that there really are, for example, values, or we have to accept that some people really are more free than other people. We have to accept that there really is a place called China, and they really do measure you according to a point system. We have to accept that there really is a place called Russia, and that right now Russia is raining down bombs and missiles on another country, which is also real, called Ukraine. Like, if we drop the truth, then we put ourselves in a position where we can't act together. But we also put ourselves in a position where we're vulnerable to people whose spectacle is better than ours. And that's Musk, right? That's Trump. That's Putin. The people who have talent for spectacle and resources for spectacle. If we can't say those things are untrue, right? If Musk calls, Senator Mark Kelly a traitor, and we don't have any basis on which to say that's not true, then we're really stuck. Then we lose out to the spectacle, which we are losing out to the spectacle. And so, like, the one thing, and so I don't think we can do it without the naive, value commitment to truth. The second part of it is the institutional part. As I said before, we have this comfortable idea in America, that if it's risen to the top, it must be true, which is very convenient because it means you don't have to do anything. It's also very convenient because rising to the top means the things that you personally happen to already believe. So it's very convenient. But in fact, the truth doesn't rise to the top. The facts require a huge amount of labor. It's much more like agriculture than it is like a thunderstorm. It doesn't just happen. for the facts, if the crop is going to, if you're going to have your crop in August, that means you've done work for the previous 11 months, right? On a pattern. And, journalism and reporting, and you can chime in here, Leah, but like journalism reporting is like that. Like it's not like immediately boom, like here I have like my scoop. And it's that you've laid the groundwork, you've done the research, you've made the contacts and da 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 da. And then eventually you can add your factual material. And our problem in this country is that we have let all that go. Like we have great reporters, but we have far too few of them. We have great humanities departments, but we have far too few, in my view, philosophers and historians, and literary scholars teaching. Right? We don't have enough of the people making enough money in enough places generating the factuality. So these are the two things that one would need to not get to the point where you're describing. When we are at the point where there's no common truth, it's really hard to act because it's really hard to communicate. Our values are always going to be different. That's normal. It's the facts that allow us some kind of overlap. So if we don't have facts, then we don't have any overlap. And I honestly don't think there's any way back from this except to regulate the social media, right? Except to turn some of the profits from social media over to local journalism, except to change the institutional balance. Because we can have arguments with individuals, and no doubt we should, about the facts, but there is and everybody should take responsibility for knowing the truth, but there is still it's not the player, it's the game level problem here, where the game is now set up in such a way that it's drawing people towards things that are conspiracy theories and big lies and larger untruths. And we can't honestly expect people to live in a democracy until we tilt that game back and change the rules a little bit.
So one of the things I find interesting is I think it is number 2 in On Tyranny. And we hear a lot about number 1, which is do not obey in advance. But number 2 is something that we're very concerned with WorldOregon. We're a nonpartisan organization, and we have seen over the last nearly 10 years nonpartisan ideas challenged. And so defending the institutions of journalism, history, science. I remember saying this to colleagues back in 2016. We're going to see a point where we're going to have to really fight for what the moral center is around these ideas. And Leah and I were talking the other day about what you do so well in terms of talking about the role of the media and local coverage. And with the loss of local coverage, basically home truths begin to not exist. We've seen many, many protests lately where the numbers reported are far lower than what is actually happening. So Leah, we were talking about this, and I think there was a good question in here about the power of looking at local news and really, I don't know, jump-starting it or defibrillating it in some way.
Yeah, I do have questions around local media. I mean, I think that's something that we've seen here, that the vast majority of people in Oregon are living in news deserts, that there are many counties in the state that have one newspaper or news outlet or no newspapers or news outlets. I think my question here kind of gets around, what you see as a path forward in restoring that, while also understanding that people are tuned out from the news, people are tired of it. I always am wondering, how do you not make it a spectacle to how do you not sensationalize news to get people's attention and rely on the tropes of social media, but also do good reporting? And what are you seeing around the world that's working?
That's a great question. And I'm going to stall for a minute by reinforcing the premises of the question, because I think the premises are really important and deserve a slow hearing. It is the case that on an international level, comparatively speaking, we know that the death of local journalism is one of the early warning signs of authoritarianism. This is a pattern that we can see, and it's a pattern that aspiring autocrats are, of course, aware of. But I think in general, it's much more important than people recognize. I think people don't see the organic connection between local fact finding and democracy. And it is an organic connection. And this is going to be my second point, because it allows people to model a couple of things that they will need to take part in a big democracy. So the United States is a big country, right? We don't 300 million of us more. We don't know each other. Few of us have been to all the parts of the country, and yet we have to somehow work together on this very big scale. Well, we can't do it at all on a big scale if we can't do it on a small scale. And the small scale, if on the small scale, if you have a reporter or reporters who are covering, your township or your town, then you have at least the notion that there are reporters out there in the rest of the country who are maybe doing the same thing, right? And then you can maybe trust, at least to some extent, that terrible thing called the media. But the moment that there's no reporter in your town, you're not then imagining that everybody else has reporters. You're just imagining the reporters are gone. Unfortunately, you're pretty much right. And so you think like, okay, whatever I found out, it's not about me, and so I feel abused, I feel neglected, I feel marginalized. But whatever I find out about the world, it's coming from the state capital, or more likely from New York or Los Angeles or Washington, D.C., or it's coming from some Russian bot, it's coming from Malaysia or whatever, Pakistan. But so when the local news disappears, you're kind of thrown out into this whirl where, in the best case, you start getting obsessed about partisan Washington, D.C. level stuff, which maybe shouldn't be so important to you. And in the worst case, you get drawn into the even bigger whirl of conspiracy theories, some of which are definitely designed to draw you in and hurt you, and many of which are not even coming from the US at all. But that's what social media enables. So when the local media goes, the social media comes in and replaces it, and it makes us much less capable of functioning in a democracy, because we don't have the practice of learning about something on a small scale and then reacting to it in the city council meeting or whatever. That goes away. Instead, the only practice we have is this sort of us and them. There's an enemy out there somewhere. And that's inconsistent with democracy. Like, it's inconsistent with making compromises on the basis of things that we know. The third part of the question that I wanted to reinforce is the factual part, the news desert part. Most counties in America are now news deserts, most American counties. And I think, turning a little bit towards the positive now, we can't get around this without both a moral and institutional and also a financial shift. The moral shift has to be that we think about local news as a public good. Like, that's something that you have to have, like, like electricity, right? Like, we don't think that it's okay not to have electricity in big parts of the country. I think likewise, we shouldn't think it's okay not to have local news, that it's a public good. And then the political part would be to say, this is not this is not a realm where we can trust the market. Just like you can't actually trust the market for electricity. That's why we have these public utilities and, these quasi-public companies. You can't trust the market for water or air either. I mean, there's a reason why you have to have rules about those things. And likewise, you can't trust the market just to generate a local newspaper. It's not going to on its own. I mean, it's fine if it does, that's great, but you have to set up the overall conditions so that people can have a chance to make money. And that's going to involve some taxation. That's going to involve some redistribution, as many things do, right? We subsidize fossil fuels to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. We can also subsidize local news. There's no big taboo there. And then that brings me to the third thing, which is financial. I think, beyond tax money, or even instead of tax money, we need to be taking a bit of the profits from the social media companies and using and plowing them back into local news, because the social media, basically destroyed local news by taking the advertising revenues away, and B, is generating what the economists call an externality by, so to speak, polluting the infosphere with stuff that's not true. And we don't have to go into a lot of detail about this, but those, Facebook no longer fact checked. Even before that was true, lies were defeating truth on Facebook pretty easily before we even get into worse social media, like, for example, Twitter. So taking a bit of their revenue and using it to fund local media all across the United States, they wouldn't even notice, right? These huge concerns wouldn't notice a difference, and we can have reporters everywhere. So that's my basic response.
So I want to bring in a question from the audience. You were talking about markets, and this question is completely right in line. It's almost like they were reading your mind. But Joe Costello says, I was and continue to be very impressed and influenced by Naomi Oreskes' The Big Myth. It traces the absurd prevalence of the idea that unfettered free markets will produce the society we all want back to early 20th century actions by electrical utilities, followed by persistent self-serving actions and messaging by US industry. Lewis Powell's call to arms to American corporations is a hallmark of this effort. How do we deal with the continuing effect of this corrosive but successful persuasion?
Yeah. No, it's funny you should ask because that's a big part of what On Freedom is about. There's a big part of On Freedom, especially towards the end in the last 2 chapters about factuality and solidarity, is about the quote unquote free market. So I'll make a historical point and then I'll make a linguistic point. The historical point is just to agree that the free market is a construct, and that if you look at all hard at the facts around it, it obviously doesn't make any sense. When people say they want a free market, what they mean is right after the government intervention that allowed me to become wealthy, at that point forward, we want a free market, right? Or at that point forward, we want property rights. So I don't want a free market at the point where the natives are still in charge of the oil. But like right after the poem or my company is in charge of the oil, well then, property rights are sacred and let's have no intervention and so on. And it's always like that, right? Like the people are interested in government ceasing to intervene right after the moment when the government has already intervened on their side. And what they generally mean is no government intervention of the kind which is against me, right? So hydrocarbon companies get a huge amount of government intervention on their side. They're not, when they talk about free markets, which they do, they don't mean end that intervention. They mean no intervention of another sort, which we might not like. So the whole thing is, is a hoax in that sense. But I want to push the point forward because I think the whole term free market is one that we should be laughing at and mocking. It's like it's a piece of American ideology which makes zero sense. And if you contemplate it for 15 seconds, you can see why. The first reason is that it's internally contradictory. Like there are no free markets. There is no such thing as a free market. What they're calling a free market is based on property rights. A property right is what they call a government intervention. You can't have property rights without a government that defines and enforces property rights. And so you can't have a free market without government intervention. The only question is which government interventions do you want? And generally, people say I want the ones I want and not the ones they want, but I'm going to call that a free market. But that's of course absurd, right? There is no such thing as a free market. And I think anybody who uses that phrase should actually be laughed at because it simply does not exist and has never existed. And the moment that we accept that it exists, like when we let that phrase go on in a conversation, we're allowing a bit of unreality into the conversation because there simply is no such thing as a free market. It doesn't exist. It can't exist. If it did exist, then we should all like if there were no rules, that would mean everybody's kidneys can be harvested. If there were no rules, that would mean that I can go and take over the oil fields because I have just as good a claim to it as the oil companies have, right? But in fact, there are rules. And since there are rules, we are now just in a discussion about what those rules should be, which brings me to the second point. There's an even deeper reason why we shouldn't say free market, even deeper than the fact that it's absurd and impossible. And that is that when we take the word free away from people and put it in front of something else, which is a human construction like a market, what we are doing is we're making ourselves unfree in a very profound sense. As soon as we say free market, what are we doing? We are saying, I'm not free. The market is free. In fact, we're saying, I have a duty to the market. The moment people utter the phrase free market, what they're saying is everybody who heard this phrase has a duty to the market not to intervene in it. You have a duty not to talk about healthcare. You have a duty not to talk about public schools. You have a duty not to talk about all the things which are characterized as government interventions. So the moment that the phrase free market is uttered, it turns the tables against the humans and it throws out a whole set of obligations on the humans towards this thing called the free market, which does not exist. So anyway, this is why we should not be talking about the free market.
I think that's interesting. You're basically saying a free market is a redefinition of freedom, which is like what I'm so interested in this way that we just redefine words to mean
Yeah.
something completely new. I wanted to ask you a bit more on this. You know, freedom is something that you talk about as a presence of good, but I wanted to ask, is that something that you've ever seen reflected in American citizens' understanding of the concept? And I think I asked that because freedom, when I think about how it's been defined to me through my life, it's something that I'm supposed to feel lucky for, that people died so I could have freedom, so I could own property or things like that. So as I've gotten older, I've started to think about how, you know, that concept of freedom was really served to me as something that's violent and that's been achieved by, bloodshed and war and things that I don't perceive as good. So maybe talk a little bit about if you're seeing that reflected in Americans' definition of it.
Yeah, that's a really wise question. I first of all, the I think it's very important that freedom is not inherited. So, I mean, at the risk of making people upset, we're not free because America is special. We're not free because of the founders. We're not free because of the Constitution. We're not free because of previous generations. It doesn't work that way. In fact, the moment that you fall in, we're also not free because of capitalism. The moment that you fall into any of those rhetorics where you say, freedom, we have freedom because of something from the past or something from the outside, something that's bigger than you, you're actually making an authoritarian turn. Because what you're doing is you're saying freedom is brought from somewhere. And it is now your job, you young person, it's your job to receive that freedom, right? And I'm going to tell you what it means, by the way. I'm going to tell you what it means you have to do. It's an authoritarian move. And I realize it's a very common one, but I'm also, America has strong authoritarian traditions. It is an authoritarian move to say that America is exceptional. That is an authoritarian move because if you say America is exceptional, that means that when we turn towards authoritarianism, well, look, that's also exceptional. No matter what happens, we're still exceptional. Oh, look, we have a fascist regime. It's an exceptional fascist regime, and therefore it's okay because it's ours, and in some way it must be free and democratic. So all of these arguments are basically authoritarian arguments. Freedom has to start from the person, the rebellious person who knows what she wants, the rebellious person who values certain things, the rebellious person who's looking out into a future and trying to impose her values onto that future. That's what freedom is like. That's what freedom has to be like. Anything else is not going to be freedom. And I take the point because it's like people can fight for freedom. Like that does happen. I believe that happens. I mean, I know some people, I mean, quite literally in Ukraine have died for freedom. Like about as literal as you can possibly get. And not only in Ukraine, that just happens to be a case that I know better than other cases. It does happen. But the idea that then generations down the line, you owe your freedom to them is very problematic. You owe your freedom to you. You owe your freedom to the people who are talking to you. You owe your freedom to the people who are alive. If we're not seizing it right now, we're not going to have it. And that's because that's the nature of freedom. The nature of freedom is that you can never take it from you can never inherit it. It doesn't work that way.
So one of the things you said that I think when I first read it, I think the trope kind of made my head spin, which is that about free speech, that free speech doesn't exist. And I think that's something, because as you were talking about free markets, I was reminded of that we are told it is one thing, we take it for granted on another thing, we like it when it works in our favor. But can you elaborate on your notion of what free speech is and isn't?
Yeah. This is one of these where like I'm most concerned that, my enemies will take the video clip out of context, right? When I say there's no such thing as free speech. I mean something very specific, which is that free speech is the wrong way to talk about it. So first of all, like I would suggest the general skepticism anytime the word free is put in front of anything else besides a person. Like anytime that happens, no matter how innocuous it seems, I think we should be on our guard because that is generally a move that is made semantically in order to deny freedom to people. And free speech, I'm afraid, is no exception. Like it can be used innocuously, it can be used positively, but at the moment it generally is not. And I think I can explain how that works. If if I say free speech, then the freedom that we're worried about is not the freedom of, Tim or, or Leia. The freedom that we're worried about is the freedom of the utterance. You've now been separated from the utterance, and we're concerned about the utterance. Okay, where are the utterances in our world? Most of the utterances in our world are algorithmically generated. Like the amount of like direct human content on the internet is a tiny, tiny percentage of the things that actually pop up in the internet. So if free speech means protecting the utterance, then that means the person who has the most followers on Twitter has the greatest claim to free speech, which by zero coincidence is exactly where the argument has gone. If you look at the public concern for free speech in the US, is it about the downtrodden? Is it about the people whose rights are actually being violated? No, it's about the President of the United States. It's about Elon Musk. It's about people whose actual right to the freedom of speech is in no way threatened. It's all gotten turned around because the logic of it is that we're concerned about the utterance. We're concerned about the ability to project your voice algorithmically, or we're concerned about the algorithms themselves. And it's for that reason where I'm trying to take a hard line here and say it would really be more helpful if we talked about freedom of speech. That would be better. But even more helpful, I think, would be to use a phrase which people don't use, which I'm trying to push into the language, which is free speakers. I think that's like that free speakers are what really matter here. And because we care about humans, right? Only humans can be free. It's not, we don't actually care about the digital thing. That's not really so important. What's important is the person, like the mortal, limited, fascinating, eccentric, unpredictable, embodied human person. That's what's interesting. That's the thing that can have freedom. And speaking is part of our freedom. It's a very important part of our freedom. But if we locate the freedom in the person, we talk about the free speaker, that helps us to recognize some things that we might not recognize otherwise. Like, for example, in order to be a free speaker, this goes back to the journalism question, you have to know things. Like part of the freedom, like Simone Weil said, and other people have said, Hegel, you're only free to know to do the things you know how to do. And in order to be a free speaker, you have to know things. You have to know things about your world. If I can cut you off from knowledge about the world, I am also cutting off you. I'm cutting you off as a free speaker. And so, but that's not true about the internet. And the internet, we don't worry about that. When we focus on the person, suddenly we realize, oh yes, to be a free speaker, you have to know things, which means that you also have a right to be educated. You have a right to be taught things that are true about the world in order to be a free speaker. Another thing that you notice is that freedom of speech is about bodily fear. So again, the internet's not afraid. The oligarchs are not afraid, but we can be made to be afraid because we can hurt, we can be injured, we can be threatened. And the whole classical tradition of the freedom of speech is about that. From Euripides forward, the notion is that the reason why we have freedom of speech is because it is risky to speak truth to power, physically risky, right? And again, that doesn't apply to the internet. The internet doesn't care, it can't be hurt, but we can be hurt, which means that freedom of speech has to involve the physical protection of our bodies, not the body, not entities that don't have bodies, like a social media platform, and not first of all the people who have a million bodyguards, right? But first of all, the people whose bodies are most vulnerable. They go first. If you're seriously concerned about freedom of speech and free speakers, you don't start from the top, from Trump and Musk. You start absolutely at the other end. You start from the people who don't have papers. You start from the people who are otherwise discriminated against. You start from the people who really have something to fear about when they say what they think is true. You start from a graduate student. Today, I think was at Tufts. You start from the graduate student who writes an op-ed and then gets abducted by 7, masked officers on the street. If you care about freedom of speech, that's where you start. You start right there. You start from the vulnerable people whose bodies are most at risk.
I want to ask a follow-up here, Tim, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
I want to talk about journalism, and I hate to be the person to bring it back to Elon Musk, but I'm going to be that person in this room. I want to talk about what we are to make of when our mechanisms of holding truth to power, aka places like the New York Times, interpret something like a Nazi salute as something else. So I think in early reporting by the New York Times called it an awkward gesture when Elon Musk did this. And this was sort of the approach that was taken by some of our most powerful and largest and most well-funded media outlets in the country. Tell me how you interpret that sort of thing and how we as news consumers and citizens are supposed to react.
I think that, I mean, that's another great question. At a human level, I find it disappointing because the world is full of real things, like it's full of real things. It's full of flowers and hummingbirds and disappointments and love affairs and Nazi salutes. Like it's full of things that we can actually define with our beautiful and rich English language. It's full of things that we are capable of being precise about and of recognizing. And I think part of, like in a very deep way, part of being a free person is seeing what's out there in the world and having the words for it. And so like at a very elemental level of freedom, the moment where we say, okay, there was a thing, but I'm not sure I have words for it. And let me use some words for it that would apply to anything. Like some people say, or, it aroused the feeling that, or, in the opinion of many experts, like at that point, you're kind of like, I think this, like the sin you're committing is that you're denying the richness and the variety, the palpability of the world around us. You're saying that it doesn't actually contain these things, good, bad, ugly, beautiful. You're saying that the world doesn't contain a Nazi salute. Because if that wasn't a Nazi salute, then the world doesn't contain Nazi salutes, right? You're saying like the world doesn't actually contain these things. And if I think I see one, I will immediately retreat to some linguistic formula. So as a historian, it was upsetting because to make the point in the simplest possible way, if that Deutsche Gruß or Hitlergruß had been issued in Hamburg in 1935, it would have elicited the response, right? Like no German in 1935 would have had any confusion about what that was. And history is also real, right? Like that actually happened. There were 12 years there where Germans more or less obligatorily made that gesture to each other. That happened, as a matter of fact. And the notion that if they could see this, they would recognize it. And it's like when we don't recognize it ourselves, it's like we're canceling that whole thing, or we're leaving it to the Nazis, right? Because again, the third point, it's not like the Nazis in 2025 didn't recognize it either. I mean, of course they did, right? The actual Nazis weren't saying, we're not sure. Was that maybe the Mussolini version? Or perhaps we should call, they knew exactly what it was. And so, to have a Nazi gesture be recognized by Nazis, but not by the mainstream is also very weird. And then the fourth point is about like how, and you've already suggested this, like how you start things is very important. Like if you start things by making them mushy, then there's always more mushiness. Like there's an inertia of bad prose, right? Like bad prose is like fungus, you start with bad prose and you just get more, like soon your whole basement smells, right? Whereas if you start by naming something, it's much cleaner, the smell is much better, and it goes on, right? So if everyone had just said like, okay, then we could have dealt with that reality. And then final thing, the costs of not identifying it are among all the others, it's a weakening of your analysis of what follows. So for example, we're now in this absurd moment where, this is low-hanging fruit. It's an easy example where the Trump administration or the Musk-Trump administration is claiming it had to take hold of Columbia University because of anti-Semitism. And that's absurd for a whole number of reasons. But in the context of that claim should always be, well, one of the people at the top of this administration performs Hitler salutes. But somehow people can report on Columbia, la-di-da-di-da, without mentioning that. And that makes no sense. And by blurring what it was at the beginning, you're making it possible for you then to blur your analysis of something later on and let somebody else's absurd claim, absurd framing continue. Like the framing that the thing in Columbia is about anti-Semitism is is ridiculous on a whole number of grounds, but that you've denied yourself one of those grounds when you've said, oh, well, who knows what that really was. Anyway, so as you see, I've told you what I really think.
So, I mean, and I had a couple questions on that, and then you jumped into Columbia, so now I don't need to do that. But what I'd love to do is, we've got some great questions coming in from folks online, and I want to fold those in. Got a great question from a local historian, Joella Werlin, and I'm going to preface her question with, I remember reading you had said that to be free, we need humanity to be restored. And what she's asking is, using the example of gun rights and the right to bear arms, it seems to me that there is a constitutional conflict between we the people and you the person. And isn't that a basic conflict at a personal level as we aim towards defining and addressing collective good?
Yeah. This seems like a really long conversation, and the problem with these, like the Q&A format, is like once a question gets asked, then I get to say whatever I want, and so I just want to apologize in advance for if I haven't interpreted this right, or if I don't answer it in the terms it was asked. So the simplest thing I would say is that I think that there isn't, I mean, the right to bear arms as it's in the Second Amendment, it has, I think, nothing to do with the way we understand it in America today. I mean, constitutional historians can disagree with me, but as far as I can tell, that's a pretty recent innovation. And the idea that what the founders had in mind when they wrote about militias and stuff was that we all should have weapons in our houses. I don't think that's actually true. So that's just like my first remark. Like I think insofar as I think the constitutional level of it is basically bogus. As far as like whether you can own dangerous objects, this gets into the individual and the collective, but maybe I would take it from a different angle. Like I think there are lots of dangerous objects that one can have, and a lot of them are fun, you know. Explosives are also fun. Tanks are fun. Things that destroy things are a lot of fun. And there's a question here about not just the balancing of adult enjoyment, which is, let's face it, that's what gun ownership is largely about. I mean, for some people, it's about physical security, and for some people, it's about hunting. And I'd be happy to like mark those off as exceptions. But for a lot of people, it's about recreation and identity. And so if it's about recreation and identity, then the question is like individual and collective, in the sense that the statistical chances are that it's going to kill a lot of people, and that's going to block their recreation and identity permanently. And so if that's the reality, then how do you make policy overall? Like, for me, that's a pretty easy one, and it would apply not just to guns, but it would apply to other things that are dangerous, but define identity, or could define identity. But for me, there's another, like, because I think freedom is about the development of humans. I see this in a slightly different way. It I think that the presence of guns in households tends to, like, it kills a lot of children, but it also tends to put a barrier around certain kinds of development that might otherwise be possible if it weren't for the presence of guns and gun violence. I think that, like, guns function a bit like opioids in this respect, that you have to think about not just the right of the individual to have the gun, or or the right of the individual to have the fentanyl. I mean, I understand you can make an individual rights claim to all of these things, but you also have to ask, what does the presence of this stuff do to small children? Because if you think as I do, and we haven't really had this argument, but if you think as I do that the critical time for freedom is early childhood, then that changes the whole discussion. Because it means that, like, you're not looking at an abstract situation of like person gun or person opioid. You're looking at a situation of, what do we need to create conditions so that young people can become free? And I think opioids and guns get in the way of that. And that's a kind of powerful argument which nobody makes, but I think for me at least, it's an argument for freedom against the easy presence of those things in American society. Again, like, I would rule neither of them out. There are conditions. I think personally, I think there are plenty of conditions where it's perfectly legitimate for people to have guns. And it's a longer discussion about like how you do that classification. I just think the freedom arguments don't work, aren't actually on the side, all in all, of people who say we should have unrestricted access to guns. I think unrestricted access to guns leads to a situation in which we're all in all much less free.
So, being World Oregon, I want to throw in, we have not touched on Ukraine, and Ukraine figures so significantly in the book for you. And so I want to ask kind of a two-part question. One is a question from one of our online audience. The other is, you had spoken previously about the significance of Ukraine as a rule of law state. So just keep that in the back of your mind. But the question, and also to have you elaborate on that, the question is from a young man who I met recently. We had Helenia Kruk, the Ukrainian poet, here speaking. And he said, I'm an American that moved to Ukraine when the full-scale invasion began to volunteer, but last month had to leave due to my own struggles with health and sovereignty. Coming from living all 5 forms of freedom and working for Ukrainians to live theirs, your health struggles described in your book really spoke to me as they're similar to my own. Looking back on your own health, how did you personally feel about the loss of your sovereignty, and did it provide personal insights for others to regain theirs?
Well, that's a beautiful question, and I appreciate I appreciate the sharing of a bit of the questioner's life. I'm grateful for that. As for me, I mean, I'm going to take the health part, and you can ask me a bit later about the Ukraine part. Being sick was really helpful to me because it helped me break through something which I think maybe intellectually I'd broken through, but hadn't broken through all the way. And that was the problem of bracketing the body. So, I mean, I think I did a very typical, and I still do it all the time, but a very typical, like, white Protestant dude thing, which is not just American culture, but also a philosophical tradition of freedom in which the body is not present. And they're easy philosophical critiques to this, right? From the side of like Fanon and anti-colonial or studies of American race, where people can say, well, of course the body, like if you're not white, the body's always present because people are noticing your body and immediately putting you in a situation. And I get that. That's true. It's ridiculous if you're a woman because of vulnerability and childbirth. It's the position that the body doesn't matter is, of course, ridiculous, but it is a widely held position, and it's one that I think I held more than I should have held. That that the bot like in some sense the body was just against me, like it was just one more thing that I was against in my negative freedom world. Like that the body is one more hindrance. And of course, that's just wrong. Like that's 180 degrees wrong. The body can't do everything, but we can't be free without the body. And here Simone Weil helps me a lot. It's the body, like the world around us. It has constraints which you then try to turn into possibilities. And it's that process of turning constraint into possibility, which is freedom. You can't just reject the body. That's not freedom. Like you can't get beyond the body, as Socrates supposedly said at the end of his life, and be free. You can't do that. What you can do is you can see its limitations. And being very sick and almost dying, did bring that home to me. That when I was, I mean, it's just incredibly simple, but when my body died, I wasn't going to be free. Like it's an incredibly simple point, but if I was dead, I wasn't going to be free. And I was thinking about that not from my own point of view, but from the point of view of my kids. That like when their father was dead, there was no sense in which anybody was going to be more free in that situation. Not just me, but they were going to be less free, right? That there's a relationship among bodies, and that in this case a familiar relationship, and that's connected to freedom. And then there was a larger, there's the larger corporeal problem that I think that white folks in America also have, which is that we take this, like we take this thing that I described as like white dude Protestant, but we take this idea that our bodies are fine and we kind of apply it to the politics, and we say, well, we're not whiners. Like that guy who's Secretary of Commerce now, what's his name? He went on the news and he said, like, if people who don't get their Social Security checks, they shouldn't whine if they don't they shouldn't whine, right? And he's appealing to a certain American tradition, which is like, we're fine, we don't need help, we don't need the government, like we're fine, we don't complain when we hurt, we're just fine. And that gets weaponized against our freedom because what we're told is, yeah, you're fine. Like your bodies are fine. You don't need health insurance. You're going to be fine. You're going to tough it out. But those other people, those migrants, those Black people, they're going to take all the good stuff. If we have a welfare state, those other people, you're going to be tough. You're not going to need it. Those other people are just going to take it all, right? And that's a very American story. And and we buy it. Not every American, obviously, but many Americans eat that up because it appeals to the sense that like we're the frontiersmen, we're tough, like we don't need the government. And anyone who's saying we need the government, like we don't like that because it's challenging our toughness, but also we think that it's all just on behalf of those other people. And when you buy that, like when you buy that you don't need a health system, for example, you are being tricked and you're making yourself much less free. And that's another thing that I think I understood in my longish encounter with our health system. It would have been better for me if I hadn't been in the commercial health system. I mean, some of the things that went wrong with me had to do with being pushed out of the hospital very quickly, which just doesn't happen in other systems. It happens in our system because it's commercial. To people who might die, to women who've just given birth, we get pushed out way too quickly because it's commercial. And if it weren't like it hadn't been commercial, I'm not going to tell the whole story, but if that hadn't happened, I would have been okay. I never would have gone into sepsis. I never would have approached death if it hadn't been for that banal thing that I was pushed out very quickly when I shouldn't have been from a couple of American hospitals. And then kind of put the final point on that. In that on the night, which was Saturday, December 29th, I think, 2019, when I like the time that I was closest to death, when I was in the emergency room, I was with a friend and who was a physician. And that, in general, in American emergency rooms, you want to, if you can, you want to have a friend who's a physician who comes in with you. I wish that weren't the common sense, but it is. And but as it happened, my friend who was a physician was a Black woman, is a Black woman. And like I remember, like as I was very ill, it was incredibly clear to me how that mattered, that she was being dismissed. And I knew, like in the back of my white American head, like I knew why she was being dismissed. Like in an everyday situation, maybe I would have dodged it or whatever, or ignored it or not acknowledged its full significance. But in that situation, it came clear to me, it was very clear to me what was happening. I had to know why it was happening, because my life was in danger. And of course, when I realized, like in that small bit of tiny deflected racism, which did almost kill me, but it's a small bit that I experienced for a few hours or whatever, when you recognize that that's how other people's bodies are being treated all the time, it helps you towards recognizing the overall pattern where Americans, because they're not recognizing other people's bodies, we're not recognizing that all of us can get sick. We can all get sick. We're all going to die. And if we don't recognize that basic commonality, then we don't recognize the basic right to health, and we all end up being less free than we would have been otherwise.
And on Ukraine, that was a great answer, by the way. So I guess the way I want to get at this is a lot of people may wonder why they should care about Ukraine. People who do not read the news, people who respond to social media. So you've talked about how it's an essential piece of geography and its significance as a rule of law state. And so what is at stake here, and how does our approach to foreign policy in this moment right now, how is it making us not great again, but actually weaker or more transactional? And what's the danger?
Mhm. I mean, there are all kinds of things one can say about the strategic significance of that country, and I'll briefly run through these. If you let Ukraine go, if you let it lose, or you negotiate away some of its territories, you're saying that the international legal order isn't valid. You're saying that the basis of the international legal order, which is that there are boundaries between states and that they can't be changed by aggression, you're saying that's not valid. And when you say that's not valid for one country, you're saying it's not valid generally. And then you're throwing the world into this new situation, which we may not immediately understand, but which will be very unpleasant, where there will be imperialism, there will be wars for resources, where everybody will be worse off. That's one thing. Another thing which is very significant about Ukraine is that it's holding off other wars. So you have to imagine the Ukrainians who have been fighting this World War scale war all on their own. They've had some material help from others, but in terms of the humans, yes, there have been some volunteers, But as the volunteers would recognize, that's a small percentage of the armed forces that are fighting in Ukraine. They're essentially doing it on their own. They're absorbing a world war on their own. They're preventing it from spreading. They're fulfilling the entire NATO mission. NATO exists to hold off a Russian attack. Russia attacked one country, Ukraine, and that country is dealing with that and has dealt with it for 3 years. If you let them go, then there will be almost certainly there will be a broader war in Europe, and very likely a broader war in Asia, because one function of Ukrainian resistance is that it shows how hard offensive operations are. And in that sense, it shows how a country that's attacked, but which is backed by its allies, can make an offensive operation long, potentially humiliating, and maybe even a defeat, which is something that Beijing has to think about when it thinks about starting a war over Taiwan. Again, if you let the Ukrainians go, that lesson no longer applies, and then you're much more likely to have some kind of war, very likely involving Americans in the Pacific. And then another one, which takes a moment to think about, which is very significant and which is in fact starting to happen, is nuclear proliferation. The Russians have nuclear weapons and the Ukrainians don't. The Ukrainians have nevertheless fought with success a conventional war. They've shown almost that you can defend yourself with conventional weapons against a nuclear power which talks about nuclear weapons. On the other hand, if we let Ukraine lose, then the lesson that will be drawn by middle-sized powers all around the world is we need to have nuclear weapons in order to prevent such an attack from happening to us. And this is not, like I've been saying this for 3 years now, but this is not a hypothesis. This is in fact happening. Countries are already talking about restarting or starting nuclear weapons programs because of Trump, because of the anticipation that Ukraine is going to be allowed to lose this war. And of course, a world which has more nuclear weapons is a much more dangerous world than the world that we're in now. Now, those are the strategic things, but in terms of us, I actually think the most important thing is about freedom, that Ukraine and Russia is about as clear case as you can have of people being willing to take serious risks to defend freedom. Right. And in Ukraine, it's not just anecdotal from me. I mean, the polls show it as well. The thing that they think they're defending after territorial integrity, which usually comes number one, but the thing they think they're defending is freedom. If you let them lose, then that is hugely demoralizing for other people who might take risks for freedom around the world. If you let them lose, it is hugely encouraging for tyrannical regimes around the world who would like to absorb and destroy countries that are freer than they are. But it's the moral piece that for me, I mean, is ultimately decisive for us. Like if we are cynical about Ukraine, if we say, oh, that doesn't matter, it doesn't matter people taking risks for freedom, it doesn't matter what kind of country Russia is, torture chambers, they don't really matter. Deporting children doesn't really matter. There's no difference between Russia and Ukraine. We don't see it. If we take that view, then we're importing that cynicism and that defeatism in a way into our own country. So that for me would be why Ukraine is important for us, or at least some of the big reasons. Was I missing part of your question?
No, on that light note, Leah, do you got a fly ball?
I mean, boy, I don't know. I've got a lot of questions, but I think the one that I really want to ask is, in your mind as a historian, what explains America's predilection for historical revisionism?
Can you just tell me what you mean by revisionism before I jump in?
I mean that, let's talk about January 6th, that is being rebranded as we speak. I've written about an event that happened in 1919 in Centralia, Washington, where American Legion soldiers and Union timber workers had a shootout, and only the American Legion officers are remembered in the town and not the timber workers who died. So it's something I've seen come up a lot in my work, and I've wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah. So I'm an American and I'm a historian, but I'm not an American historian, if you see what I mean. So there are literally thousands of US historians who are going to have more sophisticated views about this than I do. Joe Lepore, for example, is absolutely terrific on this subject. But my colleague David Blight, I mean, I guess where I would retreat to would be the point that this is very general behavior. Like the fact, you're right. And the fact that you're right is a very strong argument against American exceptionalism because it shows that we have the same pattern of dealing with the past as pretty much everyone else does. And that is to push aside the uncomfortable parts and define the people who are dominant now as innocent then. It's always like that. And it's pretty boring, right? It's pretty boring as history. And that's, I think part of the project is to make history boring. So like the version of the Civil War in which it was like the blues and the grays and like brother against brother and lots of honorable people on all sides. If it sounds lovely and it's also boring as hell and it doesn't like I'm not saying that there was not that that's completely not what happened. Of course, there was those things I described, um, brother against brother, like there was some of that, but that's not the essence of what happened, right? The essence of what happened was that one kind of system was confronted by another kind of system, which were in the same country, and there was a great moral, political, and economic issue that divided people, and that issue goes directly to the heart of what we think humanity is, and like what's humanly acceptable. There like other people do a better job of defining the drama of the Civil War, but the Civil War was whatever you think of it else. It's hugely interesting. But when you make it and like everybody was like a misunderstanding and like everybody was actually good, or at least all the white people were good, and it was a misunderstanding. Why couldn't we have, as Trump said, why couldn't we have gotten over that or through it? He said that, right? And when you do that, like everybody, like all the white people are fine. All the people who are in power now were fine back then, so to speak. You're making it all boring and you're justifying the way things are. And so I think that history is really directly connected to freedom because freedom has to do with empathy. Like if you think you're always right and you're always innocent, like you're not only going to be boring, but you're not going to be a free person. Because to be a free person, you have to know yourself. And you can't like I'm always right and I'm innocent is many things, but it's not self-knowledge. And so when we teach kids that people who look like them are always right and like they did never do anything wrong, then we're not teaching them how to be free. We're teaching them how to be conformist or self-righteous or to have JD Vance style grievance lives. But we're not teaching them to be free. To be free, you have to be able to say, oh, well, okay, those women couldn't vote, and you have to be able to say, ah, well, that black kid was born in slavery, or whatever it might be. That Polish peasant came here and worked in the farms in Pennsylvania and worked in the mines in Pennsylvania, and that was difficult in these ways. Like you have to have empathy, and history requires empathy. Like you can't do history without empathy because it's all about seeing people who are in a different time than you are and trying to see how they could have seen the world and how they behaved the way they behaved. And so when you teach history without empathy, right? When you teach history as we were always right, then you're making people less free, like you're preparing them for authoritarianism. I haven't answered your question as to why Americans do this because I kind of, in my experience, everybody does it to some extent or another. Like every controversial historical event ends up being smoothed over by authoritarian governments or governments that want to be authoritarian. And you can tell, I mean, you can tell like in America, you can tell the localities in the states where people are more concerned about freedom because those are the places where like they try to do more empathic history. So anyway.
I think that's interesting. You brought up empathy because that was another thing I did want to ask about, given that you talk about empathy in your book, but someone like Elon Musk defines empathy as the downfall of Western civilization, that empathy is something we need to eradicate.
Yeah, I mean it's very tempting to go down the kind of academic route of explaining where the word and the concept empathy are in fact located in Western civilization. Um, but I'm gonna make a different move, and I'm gonna point out that itself, I mean, it's helpful because that itself brings us back to the question that Tim was asking towards the very beginning of the conversation, like about like let's talk about what freedom is and what it's not. Musk represents a tradition, which is that freedom is about me, me, me. Me, me, me. I'm going to live forever. I'm going to own all the stuff. I'm going to go to Mars, whatever it is. Me, me, me. And it's very like it's very elegant to just say me, me, me. Like it's tempting to be in a world where you just think about like utility maximization and I can't know what your utility maximization, but I know what my utility maximization is. Of course, that's not true, but like it's very tempting to think everything can be measured, but the only way to measure is do it for yourself. And so therefore, for practical purposes, we're just going to imagine that we're all atomized individuals. And then it turns out that those practical purposes are also political purposes and ethical purposes and everything purposes. And you're defining freedom as like how I can try to have the most fun as me without ever noticing who I am and what I really want and what I might actually value. And then you produce, like, if you look at our, like, if you imagine, I mean, when I was a kid, one of the cartoons I watched was the Super Friends, and I think they were faced off against the Legion of Doom. Um, if you imagine like our Legion of Billionaires, like they basically have the same facial expressions as the people around the table on Legion of Doom. In other words, like they're not happy. Like they're angry, they're full of grievance, they have wild expectations, they're taking drugs. But like if you look around that table of our Legion of Billionaires, you don't actually see any like happy-go-lucky, relaxed. And I think that's very telling. I think that's very telling that like you can take that notion of negative freedom, that it's all about me, and accumulating and my impulses, and I'm always right. You can take that to the extreme of having hundreds of billions of dollars and telling people what to do in the White House and still look totally miserable the whole time, right? And I think that's really, anyway, that's his tradition. Like and it's a strong tradition in American politics. And that tradition is actually behind, I think, what's going wrong right now, because he is very consistently applying the tradition of negative freedom to the US government. He's saying, two things. Government's the enemy. So if I destroy it, I'm only doing good things. And like when people start burning Teslas, his reaction is, well, I'm only doing good things. I think he believes that, like destroying the government is a good thing. And then the other move that he makes is that, since negative, if freedom is negative, that means there's nothing special about humans. This is really crucial, actually. If freedom is positive, then like all of our loves and affections and attachments, all of those things uh, are in the picture. But if freedom is negative, it's just like me against you or me against the government. Who I am doesn't matter. I'm just like one more unit. And for Musk, that means, and again, this is very logical and consistent, it means that you and I and all the people in this conversation and everybody in the world, we're just nodes in some larger digital construction. And we're against things. Okay, but anything can be against things. A photon can be against an electron, whatever. They can be against things. Um, we're just algorithms like other algorithms. And if that's true, and that's where negative freedom ultimately leads, if that's true, then there's nothing wrong with stealing all of our data, with surrounding our data with AI, which is what they're going to do, and with generating like little micro programs that manipulate us. Like that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that because we were not fully, there was nothing, we were never different from the circuits to start out with. The only way you prove you're different from, the only way you prove you're different is to be that soaring oligarch, that person that's hundreds of billions of dollars. And then you get to be free, like you and your buddy Putin, who's another person who doesn't seem to be that happy, by the way, right? Um, so, so, so Musk represents a certain tradition of negative freedom, and it's taken him where he has. Now, I'm not sure I've gotten to the end of your question, though. I think I haven't.
Let's because we're coming up on time. A couple
Okay.
couple other questions from the audience. But so you're talking about certain aspects of freedom. I want to come back to the idea of defending institutions and talk about the Constitution for a minute, which is you were talking about the burning of a Tesla, for instance, but the right to assembly, the legitimization of the quarrel with Providence, and what does resistance look like now, and how is it different from say 2016 or 2020? And question from Al Jubitz in our online audience. Al's a wonderful supporter of peace building in our community, Rotary member, been a fantastic supporter of good ideas. He asks, do you think that Americans should protest, or is there value in protest? And do you think people should protest on April 5th, as people have been suggesting? And how else do we sustain a pushback against what we see in our midst?
I'm sorry, why April 5th? What's the significance? Why April 5th?
Nationwide protest was called.
Oh, just because it's April,
Yeah.
for April 5th. Okay, sorry, I thought there was
Is
another.
there power? Is there
There's a
still
layer of the
power in
question.
mass protest?
Yeah, the answer is yes. I mean, there's a whole lot. There is, as I'm sure everyone knows, there is a lot of social scientific literature on this, and it does point in a basically in the same direction, that peaceful protest within pretty broad parameters does tend to work. Now, there's a lot to be said about what that means. One thing that it means is that people have to accept the reality of corporeal politics, which is one of the lessons in On Freedom, or in On Tyranny, that it's fine to do what we're doing, like it's okay to talk in front of a screen, so long as doing that leads us to do things in the real world with other people. If it doesn't lead us to do that, then it's probably not okay. Or to put it a different way, then I've failed. Like, and this conversation has failed because ultimately freedom has to do with the body. It has to do with like bodies recognizing other bodies and people taking risks together and people showing solidarity in the most fundamental way, which is being in the same place in the same time. So there's that leap that people have to. So first, there's the reality that peaceful protest generally does work. Second, there's the leap that a lot of Americans have to make that this will be a normal thing to do, which is why small protests now are very important because they help to normalize the idea that we ought to be protesting and that Americans do protest and that it's important. Third point is the qualification. It's obviously much more dangerous for some people to protest than for others. And I'm not urging that people who are most vulnerable be the ones who go out and lead the protests. Obviously, it should be the people who are the least vulnerable. And there are plenty of Americans right now who are not that vulnerable, who can take part in protests. And then the other thing I wanted to add to this is there's the quantity of protests, and you alluded to this earlier in the context of the press. The quantity of these protests is being underestimated because there isn't enough press coverage. And that means that part of doing, and this is something that I've learned in other countries as well, part of doing a protest is planning the self-media coverage of the protest, which doesn't mean it has to be all stagey and have high production values. It just means that if you're going to have a protest, make sure you also leave behind a clean record of that protest, which other people can, and it could be a version which doesn't show faces, right? It can be this, can be that, but it has to be something which other people can transmit visually. Because, sad to say it, like, Derrida was a little bit right about this. The thing that happens has to happen over and over again visually for it to have happened in our world. And then the other thing is creativity and pageantry. It's very important not just to show up, but to have clever signs. It's very important to do things which other people around you will appreciate and which make them laugh. It's important to have often an element of joy in this, an element of having fun, and not just be like angry and against. I mean, I understand there are things to be angry about and to be against, and I understand, but there's for protests and protest movements to go on, for the whole day or to repeat, there also has to be the element of like, hey, it's good to see you again. And like, oh, look at that thing you're wearing. And wow, that sign is better than your last sign. And that, and this is kind of where art and where art comes in, like the art of making pageantry, like the art of doing something which is not just against what's going on, but which is also like askance, or goes off on a tangent, invites people on a journey, gets people thinking rather than just saying, because like if people see there's a bunch of people, that's already a lot, right? That's already a lot. But if they see the bunch of people and they see a sign that makes them think, then you've done something in addition to that. But yeah, my basic answer is yes. Like, now I'll give the negative part of the answer, which is that it's not safe for a lot of people to protest now, but it's still safe for, US citizens in general, right? There are a lot of people who'd be violating parole. There are a lot of people, who are not citizens. I get all of that, but there are a lot of folks for whom it's still now basically safe. If you don't do it now, like then you haven't normalized it. And if you don't normalize it now when you can normalize it, in 6 months or in 12 months or in 18 months, it might be too late to normalize it. And so you want to normalize it in the conditions that we're in. Like the conditions we're in now are not great, but they could be much, much worse. And you need to normalize the protests like in a nowish kind of moment. Because if you normalize it now, it might still be normal. It probably will still be normal in 6 months. But if you don't normalize it now, trying to get it normalized in 6 months is going to be harder.
Leo, you got one, and then we'll kind of wrap it up after that.
Sure. I mean, both Tim and I were both taken with your affection for the band REM and your and music. That's a band that has a big important place in my life. I did want to ask you to expand a little bit more on this role of art in this moment, even beyond protests, and even what art you are inspired by right now that you think is really notable.
Yeah. I'm both really comfortable answering that and a little bit uncomfortable. Um, so I thought this was going to be a hardcore REM question, but you bent a little bit away from that. By coincidence, an old friend of mine sent me a photo of of um, of Michael Stipe from a couple of days ago, where like she happened to be in the same place as Michael Stipe and took a photo of him with a friend of hers. But the way that REM, for those vast majority of you who haven't read the book, the way that the American rock and roll band REM comes into the book on freedom has to do with memory, and that memory as being something which is inherently human and unpredictable. So the things that set off chains of memory in us are beautiful, but they're also eccentric. Like the cues that set us off and like open up a memory that we didn't even know we had, that's very human. It's unpredictable. The machines don't have it. They can't simulate it. It's part of what makes us us. And then by the same token, um, in order to have a free life, you've got to have access to the past, and because access to the past gives you access to the future. We talked about this in terms of like about history, but it's also true in terms of biography, that if you don't have access to your own past, then you don't have a sense of what you want, what trajectory you might be on, what your own future could be. And art's good for a lot of things, but art is in my view anyway, is especially good for that. So my memories are very often triggered by films that I watched or music, especially music that I was listening to. Like if I hear a song that was very meaningful to me in say 1983, and I hear it now, I can suddenly I'm in a stream often, like where I can get to things that I wouldn't have been able to get to otherwise. And it's often true with books that I read. Like if I read Ray Bradbury is my daughter's reading Ray Bradbury for school now. And she wrecked it in her backpack and we bought another copy of the paperback. And it like that's a book I read when I was quite young. And when I read it again, I not only get the book, but I remember some of the things I thought, when I was 12 or 13. So art has that way of fixing things. A little bit like, Olive Proust or not Olive Proust, but Proust has the notion of like the trigger of the unpredictable memory. And he writes, it's a whole long novel, which we call Remembrance of Things Past, about that. But the point about Remembrance of Things Past is that they also give you access to the future. If you don't have the past, then you're stuck in a permanent present. And the permanent present is authoritarian. And the permanent president, yeah, we also have that. But the permanent present is generated by the kind of anti-art of social media, where it's like the thump, the thump, the thump, the thump. I can keep you in this moment. Time passes, but you're in this pattern of irritation, irritation, anger, pleasure, pleasure, irritation, anger, pleasure, pleasure. You're stuck in this like behaviorist manipulation pattern. And I'm vulnerable to it. We're all vulnerable to it. Most of us are anyway. But that doesn't, like, you never remember any of that stuff. You don't remember that stuff. It doesn't trigger memories. It also doesn't encode memories. So it's not only getting you stuck in a present where everything seems kind of hopeless, by the way, but it's also, it's like taking up time but not generating any future memories for you. Because like this is like a slightly depressing way to put it, I know, but like when you're on your deathbed, you're not going to be thinking back to like, oh yes, I remember that particularly clever rejoinder to that post. That's not it. Like you're going to be, if that's all you did in life, you're not going to remember anything because nobody remembers that stuff. You remember, animals and people and landscapes and connections and heartbreak and books. Like that's what you remember. But you have to get that stuff. And like art is the shortcut to all that stuff, basically. Like that's what art is. Like art is the shortcut. Art is the way into those human things that you can remember. And I think that's true of all art, whether it's music or literature or sculpture. It's the shortcut to the stuff which is memorable. It's like the connect, it's like the neural connection that leaps across, several of your neurons that have no business being leapt across. That's what art is. And so art is also important for protests, as I said before, for this reason, because it makes protests memorable. You'll remember being with people, but you also remember the interesting things they said or that were on their posters or how they dressed. Like that's why the pageantry of it is important. Like that's why that's one of the ways that art and freedom go together. And one way is the past, and another way is the future.
So we're pretty much up at time, but one of the things I always like to tell people about what we do with our programs with WorldOregon is I like to build this sort of arc of awareness to action to agency. And it's very easy to get into reading, ideas in philosophy. I know people will say to me, yes, this is all interesting, but what can I do with it? What is my takeaway? So when we think about creating freedom, or sort of deoccupying our present, what are some forms of the freedoms that you mentioned that we can activate in our present, in our communities, that move a conversation and move that face-to-face that you're talking about into an actuality?
Yeah. I mean, first, I would like to try to break down the distinction between reading a book and the takeaway. Like I'm going to insist that the book itself is the takeaway. Like I want people to go into their local libraries and pick up books and take them away. Like I think we'll all, like, libraries themselves generate unpredictability. Like the habit of reading books generates unpredictability. If you actually read the book rather than asking for the AI summary, which, by the way, every time you do it, it takes 18 months out of your life. So remember that there's a price you're paying. Also, it takes 18% of your soul. I'm just waiting for Tim to react. There we go. Okay. Thank you. That was generous. It wasn't that funny. But like, if you actually read the book instead of insisting on like the quick summary, then you're going to be changed in ways that you don't know, but actually make you more of a free person, because so much of being free is having the unpredictable vocabulary. And I mean, it sounds terribly old-fashioned and like my grandmother, but only books can give you that. Only books equip you with the unpredictable vocabulary. The internet makes your vocabulary more predictable because the internet is guided by certain kinds of erosive causeways. And so you get drawn into something. And then you end up talking like everybody else. But when you talk like everybody else, it's harder to think differently than everybody else. So I'm sorry to belabor the point, but I think like the book itself, I'm not saying my book. I don't care if you read my book, but like books on their own, in a sense, are the takeaway. We would all be doing better off. We would all be doing better if we read more books, almost regardless of what they were about. And so in terms of like my book and what I'm arguing for, you also can't, like, I don't want to say that you can just distill it, because part of what I'm arguing for is that we have to be able to talk about freedom in a way which makes sense. That we can't let freedom just be the slogan of people who want to take your freedom away. That we can't let freedom just be a cliche, that we have to actually make freedom make sense. And like the book itself is trying to make freedom make sense. And in this medium, I've done my best to try to do that too. But I can't really tell you there's a takeaway in the sense of like even the positive negative freedom, that we talked about a little bit. I can't just say, oh, the takeaway is that freedom's positive and not negative. I don't see it that way. The way I see it is that freedom is like a concept and a way of being that we have to take in, and we have to like, to live lives in which we are free people. We have to have a much broader and more coherent and richer and more lively notion of what freedom is, and we have to be able to talk about freedom that way. And that's why I wrote the book. Again, I don't care. You can go about read Bradbury, read Orwell, read read something else. I'm going through a Margaret Atwood phase myself, since you asked what I was reading. But like, so you, in a sense, like I'm resisting the takeaway bit, because like I feel like takeaway is kind of a consumption metaphor. Like I went to the store and I took away a lemon meringue pie, and then I ate it, and then there was just the tin foil left, and I recycled. Like I feel like we need to have something which is a better metaphor than a takeaway. Because I think freedom is something where it transforms us, and then everything we do is a little bit different. And then as far as what we can do, the main thing I would emphasize, which is consistent with the book, is that it's the little stuff that really matters. The little stuff. We face the whole internet every day. That is not a fair fight. We're forced to contemplate Musk and Trump every day, or Putin every day, or whatever it is. That's not a fair fight. Like, we should know about things, but it's demoralizing to have to confront like these levels of catastrophic evil, which we're not evolved actually to face. Like we're not meant to be able to contemplate something like that all the time. it's important to recognize that the best way to deal with like this catastrophic multi-leveled crisis that we're in is to be in some place in it doing your own thing. That's it. Like something that you know, where you know something about it, where you care about it, where you maybe even enjoy doing it, where you can do it with other people, and whether you can do it regularly. And then like do that. If you can meet 3 or 4 or 5 of those criteria, do that thing. And it doesn't have to be directly about saying rah, rah freedom or rah, rah democracy. It's about building a little bit of resistance by constructing something. I was at like a Polish friend the other day gave me a metaphor which he insisted was Polish, and maybe it even is, that like when like there's a boulder coming down the mountain, and how does the boulder stop? Like it doesn't stop because it hit another boulder. It stopped because, okay, there was a copse of trees, there was a little gully, right? And that's what you have to do. Like you want to create that copse of trees, you want to create that gully. Like you can't stop the boulder on your own, but you can create nice things which slow the boulder down, and then eventually it will stop. And then when it stops, you also have your garden, you have your copse of trees, you have the things that you built. And from that position, if I've been somebody who created something, you look at that boulder that stopped and you say, wow, like how do we ever let that boulder get going? And let's do something else next time.
So that's fantastic. I love the way you talk about it as habits of mind. And I think that was actually quite a very Voltaire, like, we must cultivate our gardens reference. I want to thank
on a steep mountain with a boulder coming down. Yeah.
Timothy Snyder. The book is on freedom. I highly recommend it. Leah, thank you for joining us. This was a distinct pleasure. The first time Leah and I have done this together, and I think we should just do this, I don't know, every other week or so.
We should just do this now.
Timothy, thank you so much for thinking the way you do, writing the way you do. I would also encourage folks to check out Professor Snyder's Substack, which it's really great to see. It's almost like between Heather Cox Richardson and Snyder, they're sort of sampling each other like hip hop artists, back and forth, and it's a really nice balance in your morning or your late night diet. And then
that was probably kinder. That was kinder to me than it was to Heather, probably, but it was very kind to both of us, I'm going to say.
And then back to you, Derek.
Thanks. Just wanted to echo that. I just posted in the chat the link to Professor Snyder's Substack, as well as how you can get more involved with us and you can support more conversations like this. A huge thanks to Professor Snyder for making this available to the World Affairs Councils of America and Global Ties US networks that really believe in rigorous dialogue and debate and discussion and international exchange and freedom and not tyranny. So thank you for joining us here today. Thank you, Leah and Tim. And so please do support your local World Affairs Council, support your local university, support WorldOregon, and let's help these conversations keep going. All the best. Stay safe. We will send a follow-up email with a link to this recording for those who couldn't stay for the whole event. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.